The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Riverside Shopping Plaza as Dr. James Thompson pulled his gleaming black Ferrari into a spot near the main entrance. The 45-year-old had worked hard for this moment in his life. After years of building his tech company from the ground up, he could finally afford the luxuries he had dreamed about since childhood. But today wasn't about showing off. He had important business to attend to at City Hall later, and he needed to pick up a few things first. James stepped out of the car, his polished leather shoes hitting the asphalt with a soft click. He was dressed in his favorite navy blue suit, the one his wife had picked out for special occasions. Today felt special indeed. In just 3 weeks, he would officially take office as the city's new mayor. The election victory still felt surreal sometimes. From a kid who grew up in the rough part of town to running the whole city, it was the kind of story that made him believe anything was possible. As he locked the Ferrari, James noticed the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Being mayor wasn't just about the title or the office. It was about representing everyone in the community, making sure every voice was heard, and proving that leadership came from character, not background. Across the parking lot, Robert and Helen Fitzgerald were loading shopping bags into their silver Mercedes. They had been married for 23 years and considered themselves pillars of their suburban neighborhood. Robert owned a successful insurance agency, and Helen spent her time organizing charity events for their country club. They lived in a world where everything had its proper place and everyone knew their role. "Did you see that?" Helen whispered to her husband, nodding toward James as he walked away from the Ferrari. Robert looked up from arranging the bags in their trunk. His eyes narrowed as he studied the scene. "That's a $200,000 car," he muttered. "Exactly," Helen said, her voice dropping even lower. "And look at him. Something doesn't add up here." The couple had spent their entire lives in their comfortable bubble, surrounded by people who looked like them and shared their background. In their minds, the world operated according to certain unwritten rules about who belonged where, and who could afford what. The sight of James with the Ferrari violated those rules in a way that made them uncomfortable. James, completely unaware of the attention he was drawing, checked his phone for messages.
His wife had texted him a reminder about dinner with her parents that evening.
His teenage daughter wanted to know if he could pick up her prescription from the pharmacy. Normal family stuff that kept him grounded despite all the changes in his life. He had about an hour before his meeting with the city council about the new community center project. The shopping trip would be quick, just to stop at the electronics store for a new tablet and maybe grab some coffee from that little cafe his daughter loved. Simple pleasures that reminded him why he had run for mayor in the first place. He wanted to make the city better for families like his own. "We should say something," Helen told her husband, her voice getting more agitated. "I mean, we can't just stand here and watch this happen." Robert closed their trunk with more force than necessary. "You're right. Someone needs to do something." Neither of them considered that they might be wrong. Neither of them thought about the assumptions they were making, or questioned why those assumptions came so easily. In their minds, they were being good citizens, protecting their community from what they saw as an obvious problem. James started walking toward the mall entrance, his mind already focused on the busy day ahead. He thought about the speech he would give at tonight's community meeting, the one about bringing people together and building bridges across different neighborhoods. It was the kind of message that had won him the election, appealing to voters who were tired of division and wanted someone who could unite the city. The irony of the situation developing behind him would have been almost funny if it weren't so serious. Here was a man who had dedicated his campaign to bringing people together, about to become the target of the very prejudices he had promised to fight against as mayor. "Excuse me," Helen called out, her voice carrying across the parking lot. James didn't realize she was talking to him and continued walking. He was thinking about the new initiatives he wanted to implement, the programs that would help kids from backgrounds like his own get better opportunities. Education funding, job training, community development, these were the things that kept him motivated. "Excuse me," Helen called again, louder this time. A few other shoppers in the parking lot began to notice the commotion. Some slowed their pace, curious about what was happening. Others pretended not to see anything but stayed within earshot. That human instinct for drama drawing them in despite themselves. Robert started walking faster, trying to catch up with James before he disappeared into the mall. His face was red with a mixture of anger and righteous indignation. In his mind, he was about to confront a criminal, someone who clearly didn't belong in their nice shopping center with their expensive stolen car. James finally heard the shouting behind him and turned around, confused. He saw an older white couple hurrying in his direction, both of them looking upset about something. His first instinct was to help. Maybe they were lost or needed directions. That was just his nature, always ready to lend a hand to anyone who needed it. "Can I help you folks?" James asked politely, stopping near the mall entrance. The question seemed to surprise the couple for a moment. They had expected defiance or guilt, not courtesy. But Robert quickly recovered his sense of purpose. "That's your car back there?" Robert demanded, pointing toward the Ferrari. James glanced back at his car, then returned his attention to the couple. "Yes, it is." "Is there a problem?" The simple admission seemed to fuel their anger rather than resolve anything. In their minds, his calm response was just proof of how brazen criminals had become these days. They were dealing with someone who wasn't even trying to hide his crimes. "We saw what you did," Helen said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We saw everything." James looked genuinely confused now. "I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what you mean. I just parked my car and was heading into the mall. Did I take someone's parking spot?" His reasonable tone and obvious confusion should have been enough to make them reconsider their assumptions. But sometimes people get so locked into their way of thinking that evidence to the contrary only makes them more determined to prove they're right. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything for everyone involved. James stood there in his good suit, trying to be helpful and polite, completely unaware that his entire world was about to be turned upside down by two strangers who had decided they knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. Robert stepped closer to James, his chest puffed out with the confidence of someone who believed he was completely in the right. The morning shoppers started to slow down, sensing drama in the air. Some pretended to check their phones while others openly stared, waiting to see what would happen next. "Don't play games with us," Robert said, his voice getting louder. "We know exactly what we saw back there." James looked around, hoping to understand what had triggered this strange encounter. The parking lot looked normal to him. His Ferrari sat exactly where he had left it, properly parked between the lines. No damage to any other vehicles. No signs of any kind of trouble. "I'm really not sure what you think you saw," James replied calmly. "I just got here a few minutes ago. I parked my car and was walking into the mall." Helen moved to stand beside her husband, creating what felt like a wall of accusation in front of James. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady and full of conviction. "That car doesn't belong to you," she declared. "We saw you breaking into it. We saw you looking around to make sure nobody was watching." The accusation hit James like a physical blow. In all his years of success, in all his experiences dealing with difficult people in business and politics, nothing had quite prepared him for this moment. He felt a familiar knot form in his stomach, the same feeling he'd gotten as a kid when teachers automatically assumed he was the troublemaker, or when store clerks followed him around even when he was just browsing. "Ma'am, I can assure you that car belongs to me," James said, working hard to keep his voice level. "I have all the paperwork if you'd like to see it." Robert laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I'm sure you have paperwork. People like you always have paperwork. The question is whether it's real or not." The crowd around them was growing larger. Some people had their phones out now, recording everything. James could see the mix of expressions on their faces. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed excited by the drama, and a few appeared to be taking sides already. "People like me?" James repeated, finally understanding what was really happening here. The realization was both crushing and infuriating. After all these years, after all his achievements, he was still being judged by the color of his skin first and everything else second. "You know exactly what I mean," Robert said. "Young guys who drive around in cars they can't possibly afford, looking for opportunities. Well, we're not going to let it happen, not in our neighborhood." Helen was already dialing her phone. "I'm calling the police," she announced loud enough for Ever Yon to hear. "This is a clear case of car theft, and we're not going to stand by and let it happen." James felt that familiar internal struggle between anger and patience. Part of him wanted to walk away, to avoid the scene that was clearly developing. But another part of him knew that running would only make things worse. It would look like guilt to people who had already decided he was guilty. "Before you do that," James said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket, Let me show you my registration. Don't reach for anything. Robert shouted, taking a step back. Keep your hands where we can see them. The paranoia in the man's voice made several people in the crowd gasp. James froze, his hand halfway to his pocket, suddenly aware that this situation could escalate beyond anything he had imagined. He was a successful businessman, a community leader, the mayor-elect of the city, but in this moment, he was just another black man being viewed as a threat. I was just reaching for my wallet, James explained carefully, to show you the car registration and my driver's license. Helen was talking rapidly into her phone now. Yes, we need police at Riverside Shopping Plaza immediately. We're watching a car theft in progress. The suspect is still here and we're keeping an eye on him. Ma'am, please, James tried to interrupt. You're making a mistake. The only mistake here is thinking we're stupid enough to fall for your act, Helen snapped, covering her phone with her hand. We saw what we saw. A woman in the crowd called out, What exactly did you see? Her voice cut through the tension, and suddenly everyone was looking at the couple for an answer. Robert seemed surprised by the question. He had been so certain of what he witnessed that he hadn't really thought through the details. We saw him. We saw him at the car. He was looking around, acting suspicious. Then he got in and started it up. So you saw him use keys? The same woman pressed. Well, Robert hesitated. Criminals have ways of starting cars without keys these days. Everyone knows that. James almost laughed despite the seriousness of the situation. Sir, that's a 2023 Ferrari. It has push-button start and advanced security systems. You can't just hotwire a car like that. I don't care what kind of fancy technology it has, Helen said, finishing her call. The police are on their way and they'll sort this whole thing out. The crowd was getting restless. Some people were clearly on James's side now, murmuring about how ridiculous the whole situation was. Others seemed to be waiting for more evidence before making up their minds. A few appeared to agree with the couple, nodding along with their accusations. An older black man in the crowd shook his head and said loudly, This is exactly the kind of thing that shouldn't be happening in 2024. His comment sparked several side conversations among the bystanders. James checked his watch. His meeting at City Hall was in 45 minutes. If this dragged on much longer, he'd be late for one of the most important discussions of his new political career. But he knew better than to try to leave now. That would only confirm their suspicions and make everything worse. Look, James said, addressing the couple but speaking loud enough for the crowd to hear. I understand you're trying to be good citizens.
I appreciate that you care about your community.
But you've made an error here. That's my car. I bought it 6 months ago from the Ferrari dealership downtown. I can prove everything I'm telling you. Robert crossed his arms. Then why were you acting so suspicious when you got out of it? Acting suspicious how? James asked, looking around, checking to see if anyone was watching. James thought back to when he had parked. He had glanced around, but only because he was looking for the closest entrance to the mall. It was the kind of normal behavior that everyone did when parking in an unfamiliar place. I was looking for the mall entrance, James explained. I don't shop here very often, and I wanted to see which door would be most convenient. Helen made a dismissive sound. There's always an excuse, isn't there? The situation was spiraling in a way that felt both inevitable and completely surreal. James had spent years preparing for the challenges of public office, but nothing had prepared him for this particular kind of public humiliation. He was about to become the mayor of this city, responsible for the safety and well-being of everyone in it, including this couple who had decided he was a criminal based on nothing more than their own prejudices. In the distance, the sound of sirens began to grow louder. The police were coming, and James knew that the next few minutes would determine how this story ended. He straightened his shoulders and tried to project the kind of calm authority that had served him well in business negotiations and campaign debates. The crowd pressed in closer, phones recording every word and gesture. Whatever happened next would likely be all over social media within the hour. James thought about his wife and daughter, about how they would feel when they saw the videos. He thought about his supporters and his political opponents and how they would each spin this incident for their own purposes. But mostly, he thought about the profound sadness of the situation. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to bringing people together, standing in a parking lot being accused of theft by people who didn't know the first thing about him, except what they assumed based on his appearance. The police cruiser pulled into the parking lot with its lights flashing but no sirens. Officer Maria Rodriguez had been on the force for 12 years and had responded to countless calls like this one. Her partner, Officer Kevin Chen, was newer to the job but had quickly learned to approach every situation with an open mind. As soon as the patrol car stopped, Robert and Helen rushed toward it like they were greeting long-lost relatives. The crowd of onlookers pressed in closer, everyone wanting to see how this drama would unfold. Phone cameras followed every movement, capturing what had become an impromptu street theater performance. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," Helen said breathlessly. "We've been keeping an eye on the suspect for you." Officer Rodriguez stepped out of the car and immediately began assessing the situation. She saw James standing calmly near the mall entrance, hands visible, posture relaxed. She saw the excited couple gesturing wildly toward him. She saw the crowd of spectators, many of whom looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Rodriguez asked, directing her question to the group in general rather than assuming who was right or wrong. Robert jumped in before anyone else could speak. "We witnessed this man breaking into that black Ferrari over there. When we confronted him about it, he claimed it was his car, but we know that's impossible." "Why is it impossible?" Officer Chen asked, pulling out his notepad. Helen looked at her husband as if the answer should be obvious. "Well, look at him. Look at the car. People like him don't drive cars like that unless something illegal is going on." A murmur went through the crowd at this comment. Someone said, "Oh no, she didn't," loud enough for everyone to hear. Another person muttered something about calling 2024 and asking for its racism back. Officer Rodriguez had heard enough to understand what they were really dealing with here. She'd seen it before. People making assumptions based on race and then doubling down when those assumptions were challenged. It was one of the most frustrating parts of her job. "Sir," she said, addressing James directly, "I'm Officer Rodriguez. Can you tell me what happened here from your perspective?" James felt a small wave of relief at being addressed respectfully. "Of course, officer. I parked my car about 15 minutes ago and was walking into the mall when this couple approached me. They accused me of stealing the Ferrari, which belongs to me. I offered to show them my registration and license, but they called you instead. Do you have those documents with you?" Officer Rodriguez asked. "Yes, ma'am. They're in my wallet." James moved slowly toward his jacket pocket, very aware that sudden movements could be misinterpreted. "He's reaching for something," Robert called out anxiously. "Sir, please step back," Officer Chen said firmly. "We've got this handled." James pulled out his wallet and extracted his driver's license and vehicle registration. Officer Rodriguez examined them carefully while Officer Chen took notes and kept an eye on the crowd. "The registration is in your name," Officer Rodriguez confirmed. "Dr. James Thompson. And the VIN numbers match the vehicle over there." "Those papers could be fake," Helen insisted. "You can't just take them at face value." Officer Rodriguez looked at her with barely concealed annoyance. "Ma'am, vehicle registrations have multiple security features that make them very difficult to forge. Plus, I can verify all this information through our database." She walked back to the patrol car and used the radio to run James's license and the vehicle information. Officer Chen stayed with the group, trying to keep the peace as the tension continued to build. "This is ridiculous," said a woman in the crowd. "The man has all his paperwork in order. What more do they want?" "They want him to not be black," another voice called out, which prompted several heated exchanges among the bystanders. James stood quietly through all of this, maintaining his dignity even as the situation grew more surreal by the minute. He thought about all the young people who looked up to him, all the kids who saw him as proof that they could achieve anything. What would they think when they saw videos of him being treated like a common criminal? Officer Rodriguez returned from the patrol car, and her expression had changed completely. She looked at James with what might have been recognition, then glanced down at her notes, then back at him again. "Mr. Thompson," she said carefully, "can you confirm your occupation for me?" "I'm a technology entrepreneur," James replied. "I own Thompson Digital Solutions. And I'm also—" He paused, wondering if he should mention his new position. "You're also what?" Officer Rodriguez prompted. Robert sensed that something was shifting in his favor and spoke up. "He's also probably involved in all kinds of illegal activities to afford a car like that." The crowd groaned at this comment. Someone called out, "Dude, just stop talking." Another person said, "You're making this so much worse for yourself." Officer Rodriguez ignored the commentary and focused on James. "Sir, are you currently holding any elected office in this city?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. James looked around at all the faces staring at him. The hostile couple, the curious crowd, the recording phones, the patient officers. In a few seconds, everything was about to change. "Yes," James said simply. "I was elected mayor 3 weeks ago. I take office officially next month." The silence that followed was deafening. You could almost hear people's brains processing this information, recalibrating everything they had witnessed. Officer Rodriguez closed her eyes briefly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Robert's face went through several different expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror as he began to understand what had just happened. "Mayor?" Officer Chen repeated, looking at his notes as if they might contain some explanation for this turn of events. "Mayor Thompson," Officer Rodriguez said, her voice now completely professional. "I apologize for this situation. Your documentation is all in order, obviously. There's been a misunderstanding here." Helen grabbed her husband's arm, her face pale. "Robert," she whispered urgently, "what did we just do?" The crowd was no longer just murmuring. People were talking openly now, some laughing in disbelief, others expressing outrage at what they had witnessed. The phones that had been recording were now working overtime, capturing every reaction and comment. "I can't believe this," someone said loudly. "They just accused the mayor of stealing his own car." "This is going to be all over the news," another person added. James maintained his composure, but inside he was processing a complex mix of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also deep sadness about what this incident revealed about his community. These were his constituents, the people he had been elected to serve. This was the environment he would be working in for the next 4 years. Officer Rodriguez turned to face Robert and Helen, her expression stern. "Did you actually see this man break into the vehicle, or did you just see him get into a car and assume he was stealing it?" Robert opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The truth was becoming impossible to avoid, even for him. "We saw him looking around suspiciously," Helen said weakly, but her conviction was clearly fading. Looking around suspiciously, or just looking around like any normal person would when parking at an unfamiliar location, Officer Rodriguez pressed. The couple stood there in their expensive clothes, suddenly looking very small and very exposed. Around them, the crowd was becoming increasingly hostile. What had started as curiosity was turning into genuine anger as people realized what they had witnessed. "This is exactly what's wrong with this country," someone called out. "Successful black man can't even park his own car without being accused of being a criminal." Officer Chen was trying to disperse the crowd, but people were reluctant to leave. This was the kind of story they would be telling for years, the time they watched a racist couple accidentally accuse the mayor of car theft. James finally spoke up, addressing the officers but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "I appreciate you handling this professionally. I know you were just doing your job. As for this situation, I think it speaks for itself." He looked directly at Robert and Helen. "I hope this has been educational for everyone involved. I'll be serving as mayor for all the citizens of this city, including you folks. I hope we can do better going forward." The grace and dignity in his response seemed to make the couple's behavior look even worse by comparison. Some people in the crowd actually applauded, while others shook their heads in amazement at his composure. The word mayor seemed to echo through the parking lot like a stone dropped in still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through every person present. Officer Rodriguez stared at James with a mixture of professional embarrassment and genuine surprise, while Officer Chen frantically flipped through his notepad as if the pages might offer some explanation for this unprecedented situation. Robert and Helen stood frozen in place, their faces cycling through emotions faster than anyone could track. Disbelief gave way to confusion, which melted into a creeping realization of the magnitude of their mistake. Helen's hand flew to her mouth as if she could somehow take back the words she had spoken. Robert's face had turned a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure had just spiked to dangerous levels. "Did she just say mayor?" Someone in the crowd whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Mayor Thompson," another person confirmed, pulling out their phone to do a quick internet search. "Holy crap, that's really him. Look, here's his picture from the election coverage." Phones began lighting up throughout the crowd as people searched for confirmation of what they had just heard. The election had been big news just a few weeks ago, and James's victory had been covered extensively in the local media. His campaign had focused on unity and bringing different communities together, a message that now seemed tragically ironic given the circumstances. Officer Rodriguez took a deep breath and approached James with what could only be described as mortification written across her face. Mayor Thompson, I sincerely apologize for this entire situation. We responded to a call about a possible vehicle theft, and we have to investigate all such reports, but I realize this has been incredibly inappropriate. James nodded graciously. Officer Rodriguez, you and your partner handled this exactly as you should have. You were professional. You checked the facts, and you treated everyone with respect. I have no complaints about how the police department responded today. His gracious response seemed to make everyone else's behavior look even worse by comparison. Here was a man who had just been publicly humiliated based on nothing but racial assumptions, and he was taking the high road with a dignity that left the crowd speechless. Officer Chen was still processing the situation. Sir, Mr. Mayor, is there anything we can do to… this whole thing is just… It's unfortunate, James said simply, but it's also a learning opportunity for our community. These kinds of misunderstandings happen when people make assumptions instead of getting facts. Meanwhile, Robert was having what appeared to be a minor panic attack. The full weight of what he had done was crashing down on him like a tsunami. He had just accused the mayor of his own city of being a car thief, in public in front of dozens of witnesses, with multiple people recording the entire encounter. This can't be happening, he muttered to himself. This cannot be happening. Helen was frantically trying to think of some way to salvage the situation. We didn't know, she said desperately to Officer Rodriguez. How were we supposed to know who he was? He wasn't wearing any kind of identification or badge or anything. The comment sparked another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Someone called out, "Why would he need to wear a badge to park his own car?" Another person added, "The man was just shopping, for crying out loud." Officer Rodriguez turned to address the couple directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald, I need to ask you again. What specifically did you see that made you believe a crime was being committed?" The question forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth about their motivations. Robert stammered for a moment before saying, "We saw him get into an expensive car and we thought…" "We assumed…" "You assumed what?" Officer Rodriguez pressed. "We assumed he didn't belong with a car like that," Helen admitted quietly, her voice barely audible. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Everyone present understood exactly what that meant, even if nobody wanted to say it out loud. The couple had seen a successful black man with an expensive car and immediately jumped to the conclusion that something illegal must be happening. A woman in the crowd spoke up loudly. "So you called the police on a man for the crime of being black and successful? In 2024? It wasn't about race," Robert protested weakly, but his words carried no conviction. Even he didn't seem to believe what he was saying. "Then what was it about?" someone else demanded. "What exactly made you think he was stealing the car?" Robert looked around desperately, searching for some explanation that would make sense, but there wasn't one. The truth was becoming impossible to avoid, even for him. He had made assumptions based purely on racial stereotypes, and now he was facing the consequences of those assumptions in the most public way possible. James watched all of this unfold with a mixture of sadness and resolve. He had experienced racism throughout his life, but rarely so blatantly or publicly. The silver lining, if there was one, was that everyone could see exactly why it had happened. There was no ambiguity, no room for people to claim that racism wasn't still a problem in their community. "Mayor Thompson," Officer Rodriguez said, "again, I apologize for this situation. Is there anything else we can do for you today?" James glanced at his watch. His meeting at City Hall was in 20 minutes, and he still needed to pick up a few items from the mall. The mundane errands that had brought him here now seemed almost absurd given everything that had transpired. "Actually, I do have a meeting to get to," James said. "But before I go, I want to say something to everyone here." The crowd quieted immediately, sensing that something important was about to be said. Phones were raised higher to make sure every word was captured. "What happened here today is unfortunate, but it's not unusual," James began, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "Every day people make assumptions about others based on appearance, background, or circumstances. Usually those assumptions remain private thoughts that don't hurt anyone directly. But sometimes, as we've seen today, they lead to actions that can be harmful and embarrassing for everyone involved. Robert and Helen looked like they wanted to disappear into the pavement. The crowd was hanging on every word, recognizing that they were witnessing something significant. As your mayor, I want our city to be a place where everyone is judged by their character and actions, not by preconceived notions about what they should or shouldn't be capable of achieving. I hope what happened today can serve as a reminder that we all have work to do in building a more inclusive community. The response from the crowd was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. People began applauding and someone called out, "That's why we voted for you, Mayor Thompson." Officer Rodriguez looked at her notes one final time. "Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald, I need to inform you that filing a false police report is a misdemeanor offense. Given the circumstances and Mayor Thompson's gracious response, I'm not going to pursue charges today, but I strongly suggest you think carefully about what happened here and why it happened." The warning hit the couple like a physical blow. Not only had they humiliated themselves publicly, but they had also potentially committed a crime in the process. The legal implications were just beginning to sink in. "We're sorry," Helen said desperately, looking directly at James. "We're so sorry. We made a terrible mistake." James nodded acknowledgement of her apology, but his expression remained neutral. "I appreciate that, ma'am. I hope this experience helps all of us do better in the future." As the crowd began to disperse, people were already pulling out their phones to share what they had witnessed on social media. The story was spreading in real time, with videos and photos being uploaded to every platform imaginable. By the time James made it to a city council meeting, the incident would be trending locally, and within hours it would likely gain national attention. The couple stood alone in the parking lot, suddenly looking very small and very isolated. Their attempt to be good citizens had backfired spectacularly, exposing their own prejudices for the entire community to see. They faced not just public embarrassment, but potentially serious consequences for their actions. By the time James finished his city council meeting that afternoon, the parking lot incident had exploded across social media. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications as the story spread from local Facebook groups to Twitter, TikTok, and beyond. The hashtag #Ferrari Mayor was trending, and news outlets from across the region were calling his office requesting interviews. His wife called him just as he was leaving City Hall. "James, honey, are you okay? I just saw the video on Twitter. I can't believe what those people did to you." "I'm fine," he assured her, though he was still processing everything himself. "It was certainly not how I planned to spend my morning, but maybe some good can come out of it." The videos from the parking lot had been edited and shared countless times, each version focusing on different aspects of the encounter. Some highlighted the couple's assumptions and accusations. Others focused on James's calm, dignified response throughout the ordeal. The most popular video showed the moment when Officer Rodriguez confirmed his identity as mayor, capturing the couple's shocked faces in perfect detail. Local news station Channel 7 was the first to air a full report that evening. The anchor introduced the story with barely concealed amazement. A routine shopping trip turned into a viral moment today when a couple called police on a black man they accused of stealing a Ferrari, not knowing he was the city's newly elected mayor. The report included interviews with several witnesses from the parking lot, all of whom expressed support for James and criticism of the couple's behavior. One woman who had recorded the incident said, "It was really hard to watch. Here's this successful, well-dressed professional man being treated like a criminal just because of what he looked like. Thank goodness people were recording, or nobody would believe it actually happened." Robert and Helen Fitzgerald had barricaded themselves in their house, refusing to answer calls from reporters or respond to the hundreds of comments flooding their social media accounts. Their neighbors were divided between those who supported them and those who were appalled by their actions. The incident had become a lightning rod for discussions about race, privilege, and assumptions that went far beyond their suburban community. The Ferrari dealership where James had purchased his car issued a statement the next day, standing firmly behind their customer. "Dr. James Thompson is a valued client who purchased his vehicle through our standard sales process. We are disappointed to learn about yesterday's incident and fully support Mayor Thompson. Our dealership serves customers of all backgrounds and believes that success should be celebrated, not questioned." 3 days after the incident, James decided to hold a press conference. He had spent considerable time thinking about how to address what had happened, wanting to strike the right balance between addressing the serious issues involved while also moving the community forward constructively. The press conference was held in the community center where he had announced his mayoral campaign a year earlier. Local and national media packed the room, along with community leaders and citizens who wanted to show their support. "Good morning," James began, standing behind a podium with the city seal. "I want to address the events that occurred at Riverside Shopping Plaza earlier this week. Not because I feel any need to defend myself, but because I believe this incident provides an opportunity for our community to have an important conversation." He paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd. Some were familiar supporters from his campaign. Others were people he had never seen before, but who had come to hear what he had to say. "What happened to me happens to countless people every day, usually without cameras recording and without the public attention this incident has received. The only difference is that I happen to hold a position that made this particular case newsworthy. But the underlying problem, people making assumptions about others based on appearance rather than character, affects our entire community." A reporter raised her hand. "Mayor Thompson, do you believe this was a case of racial profiling?" James considered the question carefully. "I think the facts speak for themselves. 2 people saw me with an expensive car and immediately assumed I must have stolen it, despite having no evidence of any criminal activity. They didn't ask questions or consider alternative explanations. They jumped straight to calling the police. I'll let others draw their own conclusions about what motivated those assumptions." Another reporter asked, "What do you say to critics who argue that you're making this incident about race when it might have been a simple misunderstanding?" "I would ask those critics to examine the evidence," James replied. "What exactly did I do that would cause any reasonable person to suspect criminal activity? I parked legally, locked my car, and walked toward a shopping mall. The only thing unusual about the situation was that I didn't match their expectations for who should own that type of vehicle." The questions continued for 30 minutes, covering everything from his personal feelings about the incident to his plans for addressing racial bias in city policies. Throughout it all, James maintained the same calm, thoughtful demeanor that had impressed people during the original encounter. The most powerful moment came when a young black student from the local high school asked, "Mr. Mayor, how do you stay so calm when people treat you that way? Sometimes I get so angry when stuff like this happens to me." James smiled sadly. "I understand that anger completely. I've felt it myself many times over the years, but I've learned that responding with anger, while perfectly justified, rarely changes minds or improves situations. Sometimes the most powerful response is to maintain your dignity and let your character speak for itself." The press conference generated even more national attention, with major networks picking up the story and using it as a launching point for broader discussions about racial profiling and unconscious bias. James found himself invited to appear on several national news programs, all of which he declined, preferring to focus on his duties as mayor. 2 weeks after the incident, Robert and Helen Fitzgerald finally issued a public apology through their attorney. The statement was carefully worded and obviously written by legal counsel, but it acknowledged their mistake and expressed regret for their actions. "We realize that our assumptions about Dr. Thompson were wrong and hurtful," the statement read. "We acted based on unconscious biases that we are now working to address through education and self-reflection. We sincerely apologize to Mayor Thompson, to the community, and to everyone who was offended by our actions." The apology was met with mixed reactions. Some people appreciated that the couple had at least acknowledged their mistakes, while others felt the statement was too little, too late, and too obviously written by lawyers rather than coming from the heart. James used the momentum from the incident to launch a new city initiative called Building Bridges, which included bias training for city employees, community dialogue forums, and partnerships with local schools to address prejudice and promote understanding among different groups. The program's first public forum was held a month after the parking lot incident, and it drew hundreds of attendees. The discussion was frank and sometimes heated, but it represented exactly the kind of honest conversation about race and community that James had hoped to foster. During that forum, a surprising thing happened. Robert Fitzgerald showed up and asked to speak. The room fell silent as he approached the microphone, clearly nervous but determined to say his piece. "I'm the person who called the police on Mayor Thompson," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I've been thinking about that day constantly for the past month. I've been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself and my assumptions. I was wrong. I was completely wrong, and I'm ashamed of my behavior." He looked directly at James, who was sitting in the front row. "Mayor Thompson, you showed more grace and dignity in that parking lot than I deserved. Your response has taught me more about leadership and character than I learned in years of business school. I'm sorry, and I'm committed to doing better." The room was completely quiet for several seconds after he finished speaking. Then James stood up and began walking toward the microphone. When he reached Robert, he extended his hand. "Thank you for coming tonight," James said as they shook hands. "This is exactly the kind of courage our community needs more of. The courage to admit mistakes and commit to growth." The handshake was captured by photographers and became another viral moment, this time representing reconciliation and hope rather than conflict and prejudice. The image appeared on the front pages of newspapers across the country, with headlines like "From Confrontation to Reconciliation" and "A Mayor's Grace Transforms Community." 6 months later, James was well into his first term as mayor, with approval ratings that consistently ranked among the highest in the city's history. The Building Bridges initiative had expanded to include multiple programs and had become a model for other communities dealing with similar issues. The Ferrari still sat in his garage, and he still drove it occasionally, though never without thinking about that day in the parking lot. The incident had become a defining moment not just for him personally, but for his entire approach to leadership. It had shown him both the worst and best of human nature, and had reinforced his belief that real change comes through patience, dignity, and the willingness to keep working for understanding, even when others don't extend the same courtesy. Years later, when people asked him about that day, James would always say the same thing. "It wasn't fun to go through, but it taught our whole community something important about the assumptions we make and the courage required to acknowledge when we're wrong. In the end, I think we all became better people because of it."